Sorry, one quick second. This week we are going to be learning a little bit more about the computer science behind our job. We've talked about how sound waves behave, how they get sent back to the system, and last week we kind of talked about how the system processes all of those reflected sound wave signals. Now we're kind of talking about the actual digitization of that information. How does our machine store all of this? How does it actually display it on our screen? How do we get a sound wave that we can't see, turn that into an electrical signal that we also can't see, and then somehow we're seeing something on our screen? How does that process happen? There's a lot that goes into that, so we're going to keep all this information kind of basic. If any of this stuff seems a little bit confusing once we get to like the middle of this PowerPoint, just hang on, reference back to your textbook, and try to piece it all together with the information that we learned last week as well. So when we're talking about displays, you've heard me say the word displays before, and that was mainly talking about the different types of views that we can see on our screen, right? We have M mode that's going to show us motion, we have amplitude mode, we have brightness mode, but today we're really kind of just talking about our computer screen. So when we're looking at these types of displays, there's really kind of two options that we have. We have a bistable display screen and we have a grayscale display screen. And when we're talking about bistable, it says it right in that word, right? It means two. So we're only viewing images as black or white, or a combination of the two. But in our world, we know that we need to see more than that. We need to see that variation. So we are looking at a grayscale display screen. This is giving us a variety of grayness in order to interpret our pictures and all of that acoustic and electrical information. So a grayscale display screen is going to be a spectrum of brightness levels, and it's going to help us be able to differentiate between different strengths in those reflections that are being processed when they're sent back from the body. So now we're going to come back to this at the end of this PowerPoint. We're going to kind of touch upon what's known as dynamic range, and this will make a little bit more sense when we get there. But there are some basic display controls when we're talking mainly about a grayscale display screen. One is going to be our contrast, and the other is brightness. So we need to know the difference between these two terms. They're not the same thing. So when we're talking about an image that has contrast, it's giving us a range of what's known as brilliancies that are being displayed within that picture, within that image. When we're talking about the brightness, we're talking about that overall displayed image giving us a particular level of brilliance. So if we look at these two pictures here, or these two examples, that top picture with the side by side, that's showing us our contrast. Now the brightness of those pictures is not any different. The brightness has stayed the same, the level of brilliance has stayed the same, but the contrast on the left side is much higher, and the contrast on the left side, on the right side, is much lower. Our bottom picture here, this is kind of what we've seen all throughout scanning and throughout the semester. Picture on the bottom left side, that's a really overall bright image, and then not as bright on the right side. So we'll come back to this, mainly the contrast, at the end of this PowerPoint. So like I said, we're talking about the kind of computer science behind how do we get electrical energy sent into the bot or sent to the transducer to be converted to acoustic energy. That acoustic energy gets sent into the body as sound waves. Those sound waves hit a boundary. They're reflected back to us as still sound waves. Our transducer takes that reflected sound wave, converts it back to electrical energy, and then it goes to our system to be processed. That's a lot happening from that initial creation of that electrical sound source, right? And there's still more that has to be done in order for that information to be stored in our system and then also to be displayed back on our screen. So we're still going through a lot of conversions even after that reflected sound wave has been processed in our system when we've received it. So there are two things that we need our system and our display to be able to do. We need it to store information, and we need to be able to see that information on our screen. And this is known as two different processes. So when we're storing that information as it's being processed in our system, we're calling that writing information. So our system is writing down all of that information while it's being processed. And then if we are able to display that information, it's known as reading. So our system now, we've received that reflected sound wave, we've converted it back to electrical energy, and now with that electrical energy, we are writing that down so we can keep it in the memory of the system and then also display it. So we're going from this state of writing and reading, all happening very quickly. So scan converters are actually part of our manufactured system. So it helps us to convert and change the formation of that data, right? We need that information to be able to change in order for us to process how we want it and order for us to be able to display it how we want it. So we have these transmitted and reflected pulses. These are known as spokes to our scan converter, and they're going to represent vertical lines. So when we get those processed pulses back, right, those reflected pulses, we are going to be able to see that as, or our system sees that as, a vertical line. And then our monitors and our actual computer screens are going to represent that as horizontal lines. So how are we going from vertical lines from our transducer and back from the reflections in the body to now horizontal lines that are being displayed on our screen? So scan converters are capable of altering between that writing and reading process of our system. So if we look at the two examples on the right-hand side, this is pretty much what we've been talking about this whole semester, right? We have all of that information coming from our transducer into the body, and this is how we send those pulses in, and that's how we get our reflections back, right? Those vertical lines. But our display screens and our monitors are going to represent all of that interpreted information in a horizontal fashion. So there are big differences between digital information, what we're used to, and analog information, which is kind of all around us in our everyday life. There's a space in ultrasound where both of these types of processes exist, and we need both of these types of processes. We need analog information, and we also need digital information. So we need to know the differences and the limitations to both of them and why we still need both of them. So analog information, this is real world information. This is precise values. So if you were to get on an analog scale, that scale is going to give you a precise, accurate value, even down to a specific decimal, right? So if you get on a scale and it reads 165.8 pounds, that 0.8 is telling you that that is an analog, precise value. So this is unlimited, and this is a continuous range of values. Now, if you were to step on a digital scale, this is only going to be able to process whole values. So when you step on that scale, you may really weigh 165.8 pounds, but that digital scale is not going to process that real world value of 0.8. It's going to give you a whole value. So it's either going to round that up or round that down. So a digital scale is going to read 166 pounds. So again, with ultrasound, analog information is really important for certain things, and digital information is really important for other things. So we're finding this marriage between the two. Now, in terms of our scan converters, we have to be able to take all of that real world information, right, that analog information of what's going on in the human body, but then also process that so that we can store it in a digital world and we can display it in a digital world. So it's a very precise and particular process. Now, back in the day when ultrasound was first kind of coming around and we were learning how to process and how to store all of this information, we were mainly using just analog scan converters, and it was very physical or physics based in a sense of how we were storing all of that electrical information. So you don't need to really get too much into this, but basically what an analog scan converter was doing, and we're still using it in a sense, is it has this vacuum and an electron gun, right? So our system has this electron gun, and it's going to shoot those electrons, right? That image information that we processed from within the body. And as it sends those electrons out of that gun into that vacuum, the particles are going to change. Those electrons are going to change. We're going to be slightly changing that image information because of it traveling in a vacuum. Now, on the other end of that vacuum, right, so where the electron gun was shooting all of those particles, is going to be this matrix, or it's also known as a silicon wafer, but it's mainly going to be a matrix. And the electrons, as they changed and as they traveled through that vacuum, they hit that matrix. And once they hit that matrix, they were stored, right? So kind of think of, like, as morbid as it sounds, like one of those mosquito killer contraptions. And as soon as like the bug gets stuck to that sticky paper, it's pretty much it, right? They're not coming off after that. We can't really change that information. So the matrix over time, as it was storing all of those electrons that were shot out of that electron gun, they were representing all of that information as millions of little dots. And each dot was representing some piece of storage information. The stored electron charge that hit the matrix are going to be red, and that is going to be what is displayed as our image information. So our system was pulling that stored information from that matrix in order for us to be able to see it on the screen. Now, there are tons of limitations that are associated with these analog scan converters, but the one good thing that they had was that they had like awesome spatial resolution, because the storage capabilities directly reflected the matrix. So however big the matrix was, we basically had like endless storage capabilities in that sense, and therefore we had great spatial resolution, because when our system said to the matrix, hey, I want to read all of that information that you just stored, it had so much information to give us. So it had so much detail in terms of the space that it was able to represent. So now the limitations of using just an analog scan converter: basically, as that matrix gets older, it's not digital. You can't do like a computer update on it, right? So it gets old, it slows down. That electrical charge that's stored in that matrix is going to dissipate over time. And that was resulting in our image clarity kind of fading. So we were getting this fade artifact on the picture. We were also getting image flicker. So as you were looking at your display screen in a real-time like environment, it was really slow and it was kind of flicking, because the analog scan converter was responsible for both reading and writing all of that processed information. So we were able to actually kind of see that flicker between the read and write modes. If you think of like you know, a 1940s black and white movie playing on TV, you can kind of see that image flicker, right? And that's because those cameras were trying to do two things at the same time, and it was getting stuck between those two different modes. We also had instability of these matrices. So there were a lot of factors that would result in the deterioration of that matrix. So if the room was too hot, if it was too humid, if we were using it for too long, all of that wear and tear, the matrix was really sensitive to. And of course, deterioration. So as the entire device ages, the whole ultrasound system ages, that quality of that picture that's being displayed is going to rapidly deteriorate. So of course, like in the modern world where we want to be able to go back 5-10 years and look at a patient's priors, we wouldn't have been able to do that with analog, because those images and that stored information would not be accurate after a few years. So now we are relying on digital scan converters. Now, as we just learned about digital information, it's not infinite information, right? It's giving you the cut and dry. It's giving you a whole value. So we're not seeing those little details and those little nuances with the information that it's processing. So a digital scan converter, this is using modern computer technology to convert our images into numbers, into binary numbers. So this is our process of digitizing. Our image is going to be stored in a computer memory, and computers only digest information in series and patterns of zeros and ones. So binary numbers that is only 2 values. And for computer technology, computer memory, it only does so with zeros and ones. So however that stored information is digitized, it's going to have its own unique pattern of zeros and ones, and that's how our system can pull that information. So it's a numerical representation of that image as it's processed, and then it's going to be retranslated into a displayed image. So how do we take just an insane amount of zeros and ones and alternating patterns, and how do we actually view something detailed on our screen? It's now going to go through another process. So it's going to be retranslated into a picture that we can see. So that primitive first step of translating those zeros and ones is using what's known as pixels and bits. And we'll talk about those in a second. So there are obviously more advantages to using a digital scan converter in comparison to just using an analog scan converter. And those advantages are going to be mainly going to be the stability and the durability of these converters. So our images are not going to fade. It's not going to be affected by the age or the use of our system. Speed, this is going to be an instantaneous form of processing, whereas analog took a period of time. Accuracy, this is going to be virtually error-free. And now, as we know, anytime we use something in the medical world, we never give everything 100%. So in this sense, it's virtually error-free in terms of image information processing and aiding in diagnosis. And also we're going to have uniformity. So we're going to have a consistent grayscale quality throughout the image. So these are all great advantages and why we are now using digital scan converters. So let's talk about how we go from zeros and ones to an actual picture that we can interpret. So we said that's done by the use of pixels and bits. So you've probably heard about these terms before when you're buying a new iPhone and you're wondering like what kind of camera it has on it. It gives you the pixel number. You don't really know what that means, but you know you want the better pixel number because you want the better pictures. So a pixel is a picture element. This is the smallest unit that we can actually give to a digital picture. The image of our picture is going to be displayed as a grid, and each box is its own 1 pixel. That 1 pixel is only going to be 1 shade of a color, and in our sense, 1 shade of gray. So if you're thinking about how do I get the best picture quality, and you're going to look for that new iPhone and you're comparing the two, you want the one that has the highest pixel density, the most number of picture elements in that grid, or in our case, per inch. A higher pixel density means that you have more pixels, therefore you're going to have more shades of gray, you are going to have more detail, there's more differentiation between those pixels. So we're going to have more but smaller pixels, and we are going to have better spatial resolution and image detail. Lower pixel density, the pixels are going to be larger, we're going to have less of them in that 1 inch grid, and therefore we're going to have decreased spatial resolution and picture detail. So that picture right there, that's right from your textbook, that is a perfect example of low picture density on the left side and high, pixel density on the right side. Next, we have a bit. So we said this was the other way that we convert zeros and ones in the digitization process into an actual picture. So a bit is a binary digit. This is the smallest unit of computer memory. So pixel, smallest unit of picture information. Bit, smallest unit of computer memory. So anytime we are saying bistable or binary number, this is giving a value of 0 or 1. There's only 2 options that you can have. A binary number is going to compose a group of bits. So this is going to be that series of ones and zeros. Those digital numbers, those are binary numbers. So a byte is when we have a group of 8 bits. Remember, that's going to be a 0 or a 1. When we have a word, in terms of computer memory, that is when we have 2 bytes or 16 bits, so on and so forth. So we're really talking about binary numbers. So we're talking about either a bit being a 0 or a 1, and then a byte is going to be 8 bits, and a word would be double that, so 16 bits. So our grayness is going to be determined by the cluster of bits assigned to it. The more bits per pixel, we're going to have more shades of gray, and then we're going to have increased contrast resolution. Don't be confused with this being high contrast. High contrast is actually less shades of gray. So when we have increased contrast resolution, we're actually viewing a picture that has more shades of gray, so we're getting more individualized information on that picture. So if we look at these two pictures of Babe Ruth, on the left-hand side, we have decreased contrast resolution because we're showing less shades of gray, right? It's more of a black and white picture on that left side. So we have less bits per pixel on that left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we are seeing more shades of gray, right? He looks less black and white. We see a little bit more contrast resolution, but it's not as black and white. So don't be confused with that terminology, and we'll come back to that at the end of the PowerPoint when we talk about contrasts a little bit more. Okay, so calculating shades of gray, we can actually mathematically figure out how many shades of gray are being displayed on our picture. We do so by multiplying the number 2 by itself for the same number of times there are bits. So your registry will give you this information. They'll say to you, you have an image displayed with, I don't know, 32 bits on it. And you can sit there and write out 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 for 32 times. And that would give you the number of gray shades in that picture. So for example, if they tell you that there's 5 bits of memory in that picture, how many shades of gray are going to be possible in terms of being displayed on that screen? So you would do 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. So 2 times 2, 5 times. And as you calculate that, you would get 32 possible shades of gray from a picture that has 5 bits of computer memory. Next, we're going to talk about our image data and information. So as I said, the conversion process is not done, right? Even once our system processes those reflected sound waves into electrical energy, we're still not done with converting that picture information. We're still using analog processes, even though we are a very digitized process now in terms of clinical imaging. So we're taking our analog information from really kind of within the body, right? All of that reflected sound wave, that's all analog information. It's not rounded, right? Your body just doesn't round up a gallstone or round down a kidney stone, right? That's precise information. So that's analog information that we're getting from the body. Our system is digitizing all of that processed information into zeros and ones, and pixels and bits, and so on and so forth. But then we still can't display the zeros and ones on the screen. So we also now need to convert that digital information back to analog information to see a real picture on the screen. So that process kind of written out here, our transducer is going to produce those low voltage electrical signals sent into the body. That is going to be susceptible to a lot of artifacts, to noise contamination, right? All of these things that we've kind of talked about with our system before. And we need to convert all of that information to a digital form to kind of round out all of that unnecessary information, right? Noise, that's unnecessary. We don't want any of that, right? And as we are digitizing that information, we're assigning a 0 or a 1 to that precise analog information. Some of the scraps are going to be kind of left out of that precise information while we digitize it. So that is going to kind of reduce some of that noise contamination, reduce some of those artifacts that we would get from analog information. Our system is going to kind of streamline the important stuff in that digital process. But we are then going to convert it back to an analog screen for us to actually see it. So this conversion back is a 5-step process. So again, you can read all of this information in your textbook, but the main thing that we need to get out of this is the pre-processing portion and the post-processing portion. This is a big part of our job as technologists, knowing when to pre-process our information and knowing when to post-process it and what difference that makes on our picture in the exam. So these 5 steps, that electrical signals created by the transducer during reception, right? We've received those reflected sound waves, our transducers converted them back to electrical energy, and they're converted from that analog precise information to digital zeros and ones using the analog to digital converter. So now we're getting zeros and ones. That digital information is going to be stored in the digital scan converter's computer memory as bytes, right? Any process of the reflected signals before that information is stored is called pre-processing. So now this is when right before you freeze your picture. Anything before that is called pre-processing. Anything after that is going to fall into the post-processing world. Now there are kind of 2 different types of post-processing, and we'll get there as well. So now all of that digital information, all of those reflected sound waves, right before it's saved in that scan converter's computer memory is called pre-processing. The digital information is going to continue to be processed by that system's computer, and any processing of the reflected signals after it's been stored is called post-processing. Digital signals cannot be displayed on those analog display screens, right? Because they're just a series of ones and zeros. So they have to be converted back to analog information by the digital to analog converter. So we went from analog to digital converter, and now we're going back with a digital to analog converter. This is all in the manufacturing of our systems. That analog signal is now going to be able to be displayed on our computer screen. So a lot of information is being altered and affected, all for us to be able to see something on our screen. And if you think about it, it's kind of really remarkable about how fast you put that transducer down on somebody's abdomen and you immediately have a picture on your screen. So that is how instantaneous all of this information conversion is happening, even from the start of just getting an electrical pulse from the system, sending that to our transducer, converting that to acoustic energy, sending that in, getting the reflections, changing that back. All of that happening within the blink of an eye is really kind of remarkable. So like we said, pre-processing and post-processing, really important for us to be aware of. So pre-processing is the manipulation or changing of image data before it's stored in the scan converter. So there are some things that we can control in the pre-processing sense, right? So before we're hitting that freeze button, we are pre-processing. So we're changing our TGC, our gain, our right magnification, which we'll talk about in a second. We can change our compression. We can change our temporal and our spatial compounding, which we'll also learn about today. We can change our edge enhancement, which is kind of going to go hand in hand with contrast, and we'll also get to that, as well as fill-in interpolation. So a lot of things that we can change in terms of that image information before it's stored in the system. This is going to alter the image information forever. So once you pre-process your scanning information and then you hit freeze, that's it. Like once you hit freeze, you can't reverse what you just did in that pre-processing change. So we'll kind of pay a little bit more attention to this when we are scanning in lab, and I'll kind of give you guys a few examples in order to determine what would be pre-processing and what would be post-processing. Now, post-processing, this is some of the things that we can change once that image information is stored in that scan converter. So there are some things that we can change, but we try to not post-process as much as we want to pre-process. Pre-processing is what we should be focusing on. Post-processing is kind of like, I don't know, like rushing to do your homework, right? So there are certain things that we can do, but we don't want to rely on this. And there are also certain things that we can't do in terms of post-processing. So this is also going to be controlled by us. We can do black and white inversion. We don't really do this too often, but some of the radiologists will do this, especially in breast imaging. They'll just invert the black and white scale. We can do read magnification. So on pre-processing, we could do write magnification. Post-processing, we can do read magnification. We'll learn about that. We can also adjust our contrast. We can do 3D rendering from post-processed pictures, but it's not going to be as great as doing pre-processing 3D rendering. 3D is something that you may have the opportunity to see at some of your clinical sites, but it can be very challenging depending on what you are trying to get a 3D image of. Everyone sees those really cute baby faces. Those are not easy to create. And when you rotate through women and infants, you'll see that 3D imaging is really not used that often. And if it is used, it's for IUD placement, it's for endometrial polyps. It's not really providing those cute baby faces that we're used to seeing. And all post-processing changes can be reversed to that original pre-processing stored information. Okay, so magnification. Up until this point, you've probably just thought that there's zoom, and that's it. And that's not the case. Zoom, also known as our magnification, is a two-option process, either read magnification or write magnification. We want to always be doing write magnification. This means that while you're live scanning, you are zooming in, right? You're magnifying your picture while you're still in the pre-processing phase. And there are reasons why we want to do that instead of doing the post-processing magnification. When you are doing the pre-processing magnification, you're still live scanning, the system is going to go through a very particular process. So the system, you're going to be scanning that anatomy. Your image is going to be converted from analog to digital and is going to be stored in the scan converter. The sonographer, you, is going to pick up the region of interest that you want to look at, and the system is going to discard all of the existing data in that scan converter. So all of that previous pre-processing information that it had is now going to be erased, and it's only solely going to focus on rescanning that zoomed in area that you picked, and it's going to be writing new information as you're scanning that area zoomed in. So the number of pixels in that magnified region of interest is going to be greater than the original number, and you're going to have better spatial resolution in that zoomed in region while you are doing it still live scanning. Now, write magnification is you've frozen your picture on your CBD and then you want to zoom in to measure it. You can still do that, it's still fine, but that's not going to result in better spatial resolution. That's not going to result in a better, more high quality picture. All that's going to do is it's going to magnify that same image, so you're still going to have the same number of pixels, and you're just making them bigger. So as you make those pixels bigger, as we saw a few slides ago, your image detail doesn't get better. If anything, it could potentially get worse, but in ultrasound sense, it's going to stay the same. You're not making the system write any new information. You're not changing any of that information. All you're doing is making it bigger. So here we have two examples of that read and write magnification. So read magnification, this is post-processing. This is taking that old data or that initial data, and it's just magnifying it. It's just making that pixel size larger. So you still have the same number of pixels. It's not really going to do anything for you except make that region of interest bigger. So if you look at this middle picture here, it's exactly what that did. Our pixel number didn't change, and the pixels got bigger, and now therefore it's just kind of like a blurry choppy picture. Now, when we do right magnification, you're live scanning, it's pre-processing, you're hitting your zoom button, you are telling the system that, hey, I really want to focus in on this area, so continue to write new information as I'm scanning this zoomed in region. So this is going to give us more pixels than the original region of interest, right? Because the original region of interest was a big old sector shaped display screen. Now we're focusing in on a much smaller region, so we can send more pixels to that region, and that's going to give us better spatial resolution, and it's actually going to improve our temporal resolution as well. So our the time it takes our system to send these pictures to be displayed is going to be much faster. So we're going to have better temporal resolution when we're using right magnification as well. We're getting rid of all of that unnecessary information surrounding this region of interest, and we're just focusing on the region that we want. So next we have a few concepts that are going to seem a little bit bizarre, and you don't really need to know them in terms of scanning, but you do need to know these for your registry. Our first one is going to be coded excitation, and this is something that when manufacturers started to digitize these ultrasound machines, it was a way of improving our image quality, but still making sure that our systems were safe. So it was developed within the context of our bioeffects. And if we remember, bioeffects came up a lot in our intensity lecture, right? So that's the main thing that we need to be aware of in terms of using ultrasound with humans. We need to keep the intensity of our sound source within a safe and healthy range. So this coded excitation, this manufacturing process, it keeps the maximum intensity of the sound beams within a specific limit that they set. But it's also going to still be able to produce an intensity that results in good image quality. So what this coded excitation does is it creates these long sound pulses with a wide range or a wide variety of frequency, and it's going to distribute that energy over a broader frequency range. So we're not just sending in that maximum intensity of the sound beam, in one burst. We're kind of doing it over a range of frequencies when we're sending that pulse in. Now remember, a pulse is a collection of sound waves, right? So we can have variations to those sound waves in that pulse that we send in. So if we're sending in a long sound pulse, we could have a lot of sound waves with different variations to them. Coded excitation is also going to distribute that energy over a broad frequency range. As we said, the pulse is still going to be strong, right, to still get that good image quality, because we still have the same intensity level, but we are sending it out over a longer range. So it's a little bit safer and better for the patient. And it's also going to result in improved penetration, because as we know, the longer our sound pulse is, the more imaging depth we can evaluate. So here is just an example of coded excitation. As we said, with this process, we're kind of spreading out that peak intensity over a range or over a longer period. And it's going to result in a higher signal to noise ratio. So we're getting rid of all of that contamination. We're going to have better axial, spatial contrast, resolution. We're going to have deeper penetration. So basically, this is what our system wants to do, right? Where we have that peak intensity, but now we're kind of spreading it out over a period of a longer pulse. That looks like a kindergartner trying to follow that line. Okay, so next, kind of following up with what we had mentioned prior, spatial compounding, and we also will have frequency compounding in a second. But spatial compounding, anytime we hear the word spatial, this is talking about actual space, right? So it's a method, again, kind of similar to coded excitation, that is embedded into the manufacturing of our system, but it's a method of using information from multiple different angles to produce one single image. This acquires frames from those multiple angles, and the frames are then going to be overlapped to form one single real-time image. The number of frames and the steering angles of those frames are going to vary depending on the transducer that we're using and what we're using this for in the clinical environment. As we know, more frames, we're going to have better image quality, but with more frames, we could have decreased temporal resolution and lower frame rate. So we're going to have better image detail if we're using multiple different imaging pulses. But as we know, the more we make our system do, the slower it gets and the worse temporal resolution we're going to have. So what does that look like? So here we have our transducer. Now this is all going to be the same transducer, right? Sending in 3 image pulses in different angles. And then we overlap all of that information and it's processed as one single picture. Now, of course, this is going to result in great detail because look at how many scan lines we have with that, right? Look at how much information we're going to be able to pick up with using all 3 variations of scan lines and pulses. But also think about how long it's going to take our system to be able to actually send all of that information in and process all of that information once it comes back to us. So it's kind of a give and take of what we need it to do. And again, depending on what we're looking at, if we need better temporal resolution, if we're trying to evaluate a vessel or we're using this for echocardiography, we're probably not going to want to risk the temporal resolution and frame rate just so we can get a slightly better image quality. So it all depends on what you're trying to evaluate. Next, we have frequency compounding. So this is going to be a little bit different. This is another technique that our systems use to help us reduce some of those image artifacts that we can get. The reflected sound pulses, they are going to contain a large range of frequencies. Typically, the entire reflection is going to have a range of frequencies, and we use that range to create our image. Now, remember, this is coming from the body. So as that sound pulse is hitting a boundary in the body, when it reflects that information back, it's not all going to be reflected with the same strength, the same intensity, the same frequency, right? It's all going to be a little bit variable. So we use those variations in that reflected information, and we kind of create an image from each of those. So it's almost like the system is taking averages of the ranges of frequencies that are being reflected back to us, and it's using each of those sub-bands, as they're known, to combine to create a larger image. So again, this is not something that you're doing in the clinical sense. We're not taking this into consideration when we're scanning, but it is something that you need to be aware of in terms of the manufacturing processes for your registry. This is also really going to help our system reduce overall noise. So when we have a system that has really great signal to noise ratio, it's probably going to have a lot of frequency compounding happening behind the scenes that we just aren't able to visualize while we're scanning. Next, we have edge enhancement. So this is kind of close to contrast in a sense, but what this does is it makes our image, the borders in our image, look much sharper. So what the computer does, it identifies those borders and it emphasizes the boundaries between the 2 structures. So the reflecting surfaces between 2 media with different grayscale levels is going to be emphasized so it looks sharp on our image. This is going to increase the image contrast in the area near those borders and near those boundaries between 2 media. And it's going to create a subtle bright and dark highlight on either side of the boundary to make it appear more defined. So if you look really closely at the bottom picture, it almost looks like there's a black border between the white and gray swirls, and then it starts to get slightly lighter and slightly lighter. And on the other side of that black interface, it looks really bright and starts to get darker and darker. So it's really just emphasizing and creating a sharpness between the 2 boundaries of different media being reflected. and processed. Next, we have temporal compounding. Again, another manufacturing process or technique that continues to display information from older images. So it's kind of like artificial intelligence in the system itself. It keeps like a memory of what it just processed to help the system more efficiently work as we continue to process newer information. So previous frames are going to be superimposed on the current frame, and it's going to create a smoother image with a higher signal to noise ratio and improved image quality. It does result in lower frame rate and decreased temporal resolution because, again, we're kind of superimposing an old picture onto the new picture or the new frame that we're trying to process, but it's a little bit easier for that system in terms of muscle memory. Next, we have fill-in interpolation. So this is we can only use this with 2D images. We can't use this with 3D pictures, but 2D images are going to be created from multiple pulses directed into the body, right? We already know that from our transducer. With sector images, the scan lines become further apart the more they travel, right? So if you're starting at the same starting point, but you're heading in different directions, the further away from that starting point you travel, the further away you travel from each other. So the computer kind of uses those intentional scan lines, and it creates these simulated kind of data points in between the gaps to kind of fill in all of that missing information. So the computer is trying to predict the grayscale levels of that data that's sitting in between those widened scan lines as they travel. So it's using information from its neighbor to kind of piece it together a little bit more so that we can have better spatial resolution, so that we don't miss a small mass in between two scan lines, so that we don't miss a calcification or something hanging out between those widened scan lines. And just finishing up with this first portion, and then we'll move into dynamic range a little bit. PACS and DICOM, this is something you guys are probably very familiar with at this point, but these are two different types of systems that we are using in healthcare. PACS is super, super important for anyone in medical imaging. This is our picture archiving and communications system. Anywhere you work is going to have some type of PACS system. This is a digital library where all of our images and exams and medical information are going to be digitized and stored. It's a really big computer network. It gives you instant access to really old and archived studies, and none of that older information is going to degrade for any reason, right? So we store and forward information to transmit and send out reports and send out images to locations that maybe off-site or off-campus or across the country. So it's a really great modern system that healthcare facilities really rely heavily on. And then DICOM stands for Digital Imaging and Computers in Medicine. So this is, not something that you're going to find on every single computer in a hospital, but it is something that you are going to find on any computer that you can use to look up a PACS system. So this is going to be a set of rules and protocols that allow imaging systems to share information on a particular network, and it allows the system to connect to PACS. Therefore, it's going to allow individual devices, individual computers to share, manage, and distribute images regardless of the manufacturer. So say you are working in a cardiologist office and they rely heavily on getting echo ultrasounds from 4 or 5 different facilities, and you are the cardiologist and you really like viewing those pictures and not just the report, well, you could potentially be set up with a DICOM system where all of those different echo machines and all of those different echo facilities can send you those pictures. So it's just a particular process that has a lot of approval that goes behind it, but it's a way for healthcare teams to work like a team. A lot of times you hear doctors or patients saying, my doctors don't communicate. And unfortunately, that's just a problem we happen to see everywhere. And DICOM is trying to kind of bridge that communication issue between different facilities and providers. Okay, you can also review your elastography. This is something that we're really going to get into in your final spring semester. We'll learn all about how to perform elastography exams, but for your registry for physics, you do need to know how that type of application works on our system. And then you can also read a little bit more about how we can record and archive certain techniques. Moving into our dynamic range. So this is where our contrast kind of comes into play. So dynamic range itself is the method of describing the extent a signal can vary and still be accurate. So this is giving us a number of available choices, right? Our dynamic range is giving it the lowest threshold and then the highest threshold. Anything in between those two thresholds will be able to be displayed accurately. So again, an example here, a scale can weigh from 30 pounds to 300 pounds accurately, right? If you if you put your dog on there and your dog only weighs 15 pounds, it's too weak for the threshold. That needle on the scale is not even going to move at all. It's not going to process any of that information because it doesn't meet the minimum threshold. Now, if you were to put your car on the scale and it weighs more than 300 pounds, of course, that information is too much and it saturates the system, so it's going to cap out at 300 pounds, right? Neither of those are going to be accurate because they fall below the dynamic range for that really small dog and above the dynamic range for putting your car on a scale that can only hold 300 pounds, right? So in ultrasound, we report this range in decibels, and it's giving us a relative measurement or a ratio between the largest signal that we can accurately process and the smallest signal that we can accurately process. And there are certain components that process particular ranges in terms of dynamic range. So dynamic range of information is going to decrease the more it is processed. When we post-process, we decrease the dynamic range more than when we pre-process, right? So when we're pre-processing, we're writing new information. So our dynamic range is really not going to change as much, but if we post-process, we can change that dynamic range of our information more. So the components earliest in the imaging change process data with the widest dynamic range. Our transducer, right? Which transducer we decide to pick for our exam is going to set the dynamic range that we can scan within. The receiver in our system also has a dynamic range that it's going to work within the confines of. Our scan converter, right? So going from analog to digital and then back from digital to analog, those are going to have ranges to them. Any information that falls below or above that range is not going to be processed or stored. Our display screen is going to have a range as well. Not every computer screen can display every level of brightness or darkness possible. And then also our archiving system will have a limit to the range of information that it can save. So it's also, like we said, it's known as our number of choices that fall within the lowest and the highest in terms of processing the signal. This is going to be reported as the number of possible gray shades. Now, when we have a wide dynamic range, right, so we have a big variation between our lowest threshold and our highest threshold, this means that we can process and display tons of shades of gray. The more shades of gray we can process and display, the lower our contrast is going to be, but the better our contrast resolution will be. It's giving us more information, right? It's giving more unique information, individualized, whereas high contrast images, that's giving us fewer shades of gray. It's more black and white, right? So it's kind of just either rounding some of that information into the black category, or it's rounding some of the information into the white category. It's not treating each electrical signal as its own individual shade of gray. So when we have a narrow dynamic range, we have fewer shades of gray, right? Our spectrum of availability in terms of our threshold is less, right? We don't have as much space within those confines to process that information. So it's going to result in higher contrast, more black and white, because we don't have as many shades of gray to represent. Whereas that wide dynamic range, low contrast, many shades of gray, better contrast resolution. So lots of information. If anyone has any questions, happy to answer. Otherwise, you guys are all set, and I will see you in lab on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.